Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, did you watch the Super Bowl Sunday night? Never mind the game. Did you see the Ontario election ads? We'll take you through them.
We thought we'd dodge tariffs, but it turns out not entirely. The U.S. president has brought out a new round of tariffs on steel and aluminum, and we'll discuss the implications for Ontario.
All the parties have something on offer about health care. Are any of the pitches really doable? We'll explore that.
And on our quote of note, the Liberal leader has challenged the PC leader to a contest of sorts.
Stick around and we'll tell you if we can expect to see Bonnie Crombie and Doug Ford in the octagon.
It's Tuesday, February 11th, 2025, so let's get to it.
Hello, JMM.
Hello, Steve.
Little sugar to start with.
Always.
We are mixing things up a little bit on the podcast. Last week we had that crossover version where the folks from the Trillium joined us. And today we are joined by, we've never done this before. This is very exciting. Look at this. We have a live studio audience here. We are trying a few new things to keep it fresh because, after all, we wouldn't want this relationship of ours to become like every other marriage, right?
I feel suddenly in danger of what my wife would say, depending on how I answer that question. But we will move on. Mm-hmm. For our listeners, would you be interested in a live onpoli show? Email us in at onpolitics@tvo.org, and we would, of course, love to know your thoughts.
Indeed, we would. And with that, let's get on with the show. We're off to issue one. The Philadelphia Eagles crushed the Kansas City Chiefs in this past Sunday's Super Bowl. And as much as I know JMM was watching to see what kind of blitz patterns the Eagles defense was using to get to Patrick Mahomes, he may have been on the lookout for something else as well, I suspect.
It's true. I mostly just watched the Super Bowl for the ads, specifically the ones that played from the Ontario Liberal Party and the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party.
That, too, was an interesting matchup, actually, although I am interested in your conclusion of how the Eagles D managed to get to Mahomes so often, despite only rushing 4 guys and bringing 7 back into cover 2 defense. What did you think of that approach?
There are subjects that I'm just not able to comment on intelligently. I think I might even be on less solid ground than discussing like the Kendrick Lamar Drake beef.
Did you see the halftime show?
No.
Okay. Well, I did see it.
I saw it after the fact.
You saw it after the fact? I did watch the halftime show. It was Kendrick Lamar.
Yes.
Didn't understand a word of what he said. But that may have more. You know what, though? Watch with a bunch of guys, none of whom knew none of the songs. We knew none of the songs. But the 3 grandchildren in the room sang along and knew every single lyric. So it just goes to show you.
Kids these days.
My time has passed. Yeah, kids these days. Why don't we stick to analyzing the political ads
that's
instead?
What you and I are best built for.
Maybe. Here's one from the Liberals. Let's start with that.
Doug Ford just said he was happy Donald Trump won the election.
In the election, was I happy this guy won 100%? I was.
Happy?
What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state.
Was he happy Canadians might lose their jobs?
The tariff will be substantial.
Or does he just care so little about the people of this province that he saw an attack on Ontario as an opportunity for himself?
We need a clear mandate for 4 years of dealing with our American friends.
Was I happy this guy won 100%? I was.
Well, ever since Doug Ford got caught inadvertently on a hot mic saying that he was 100% in favor of Donald Trump winning the election, that has had a lot of airplay. Yeah. And it got some airplay during the Super Bowl as well. What'd you think?
I will be surprised if we get to the end of this election without that clip being turned into like a dance mix or something. I think the opposition parties want to blanket the airwaves as much as they can with that clip. They want that clip to be what you think of when you see Doug Ford's face. But I got to say, Doug Ford has a very long history of saying things that get him into hot water. I remember the 2018 Liberal campaign strategy was to dig up all of these sometimes offensive quotes from Doug Ford's earlier time in politics. And it just didn't work. People have sort of priced in the fact that Doug says things sometimes. Now, maybe it'll be different this time. Clearly, they are trying to make it different this time. But the precedent here is not obviously great for the opposition.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'd make a couple of observations. Number one, I think you have to give props to the Liberals for the fact that this piece of tape became public, and they turned it around in relatively short order and made an attack ad out of it. So in terms of their ability to respond to unfolding events on the ground, Good for them. They got in there quickly and made something happen. Second thing is, though, and my hockey buddies are my great focus group because you and I are not real people, but they are real people. My hockey buddies said, oh, yeah, that's just Doug being Doug.
Yeah.
So you talk about this is all priced in or baked into the cake. I'm not sure anybody, certainly not the people I play hockey with, were particularly perturbed about the fact that Doug Ford was being his authentic self, talking about how much he wanted Trump to win. I mean, of course he wanted Trump to win. He's been a big Trump fan for as long as he's been in public life. So there's that.
Not anymore, he says.
Not anymore. He says not since, we can't say it, right? This is still a family pod?
Yeah, I think...
Mr. Ford said he used an F-bomb. Anyway, I can't say it. Let's move on. Let's do the PC ad now, which of course is all about protecting Ontario. So if you would, let's have a look at that one.
We all have things we worry about. But when we know trouble is headed our way, we need a fighter. Someone who protects us, our jobs, and our families. That's Premier Doug Ford. When Ottawa descended into chaos, he stood up for us.
Now taking Trump on tonight, Ontario Premier Doug Ford.
The next 4 years won't be easy. There's big decisions ahead, and there's only one leader to protect Ontario. That's Premier Doug Ford.
Who's going to fight for you is the slogan at the end. Okay, a few observations right off the top here. Number one, we have to tell the folks at CNN that it's not Premier, it's Premier. That's how you pronounce it up here. Number two, did you catch the scene in there that was clearly done for the commercial and that in real life would never, ever happen?
You're talking about him getting into the driver's seat of a car.
That is true. Now, people may not know this. If you are the Premier of the province of Ontario, not only do you not have to drive, you are not allowed to drive.
The OPP has strong opinions about
They
this.
do, because they can't guarantee your security if you're going to drive your own car. So there's no question that when Doug Ford got behind the wheel and started to drive his car, that's something that never happens except for television commercials. So we put that on the
Kathleen
record.
Wynne used to lament, because she enjoys driving so much, that she used to lament that when she became premier, she couldn't drive her car for about 5-6 years.
Yeah, not allowed to. What else did you notice in the spot?
Well, that shot of the reporters surrounding Doug Ford, I think one of our colleagues referred to it as the Last Supper shot. And you can clearly see a friend of the pod, Global News reporter Colin DeMello, looking directly into the camera.
Do we have a shot of that?
Really great shot. I don't know if we have that still available, but yes, I love that shot.
Yeah, there we are, looking right into the camera. Now, I'm not sure that's what the Tory Brain Trust was hoping that you would pick up on in the ad, that shot of Colin DeMello. I'm sure that what they wanted you to look at was the leader of the PC party sitting in the middle of the shot with microphones, I don't know how many, 20, 25 coming in from every direction, showing him right at the center of everything, which of course that's the message they want to convey. Doug Ford's at the center of everything right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does have that sort of Renaissance painting vibe.
Yeah.
And I think, from the moment we saw that picture go online, you realize it's sort of a dream shot for the premier, for the Progressive Conservative Party, as you say, like literally at the center of the action, at the center of national attention. The context of that picture was it was either the day of or the day after that Chrystia Freeland had announced her resignation from cabinet, and so Doug Ford had, by implication, been elevated into this position of being one of, if not the most powerful politician in the country. The prime minister badly weakened. We had a finance minister, but I'm not sure 90% of voters could have picked him out of a lineup the day after, if you know what I mean. So that picture really works for the purposes of the PC ad. It also, I think, works for the message of the campaign so far, which really is the PC party talking about the premier, his proposals, his actions. And I'm trying to go back to, the press conferences I've watched, I don't know if he's mentioned the opposition parties, aside from occasionally in passing, not even to attack them very much. No. There's been a handful of
Talks about
bombs.
Trump.
But yeah, he'll talk about what he wants to do. He'll talk about Trump. He will talk about the federal government and what he believes the federal government should be doing. But as far as Doug Ford's availabilities have been concerned, the opposition parties might as well not exist.
Well, I guess when you're 20 or 25 points ahead, which is what the polls indicate people thought yesterday.
Yes.
As we remind people, polls are not predictive. They can't tell you what people are going to think tomorrow, but certainly what people thought yesterday is that Mr. Ford has a big lead at the moment. 2 leaders' debates still to come, so we'll see how things go. But why would you give any ice time at all to your opponents if you're that far ahead of them?
Yeah.
I think is probably the thinking. Now, if you watch the Super Bowl, you will know that the Liberals had ads, the Tories had ads, the New Democrats did not have ads, but we did want to include them in this ad palooza that we're doing here. So Mara Stiles, the leader of the NDP, did drop a new ad last week. It is mostly in rotation. I guess you don't call it in rotation if it's on social media. It's out there on social media. And here's what that looked like. Roll it if you would.
I'm Mara Stiles, and I've spent my life fighting for working people and winning. Now I'm running to be premier, to build homes, hire doctors, fix schools, and make life more affordable. Life in Ontario is harder than it should be. Well, unless you're one of Doug Ford's friends, right, that he makes those deals with. With everything that's at stake, we need new ideas. I'm Mara Stiles, leader of Ontario's NDP. In this fight, I'm on your side.
You saw that little shiv there, right? Right in the middle? Little shiv right in the middle. We've got Doug Ford. He's fighting for you, according to the tagline of his ad. We have the Liberal ad, which ends with more for you. That's their slogan. NDP says they're on your side. Seems to be a theme emerging here, would you say?
Yes. And, you know, back in 2018, right, Ford ran under the banner of For the People when, of course, he was running against the incumbent government, the implication being that they were not for the people. At the end of the day, I think politics is often a lot simpler than we sometimes make it out to be. You know, Doug Ford does not need to tell people he is for you, for the people, on your side after 6 or 7 years. That is just his brand. And we've talked a lot about, we've used words like priced in and baked in. Like this is just what people see when they hear about him or see his face on the news. So he can now spend this campaign, which I will remind people, like he picked the timing of. He can spend this campaign, you know, trying to look statesman-like, and that's part of what that message of that ad was, right? And the opposition parties are the ones really trying to dent that image, and so. You know, that was part of what we saw with Crombie's ad, and part of what we see with Stiles' ad, the reminding people that, of course, there are controversies about the PC government, including its connection to certain well-heeled interests.
Well-heeled interests? Did you want to be more specific about that?
Well, certainly if we asked the NDP to be more specific, they would talk about the deal for the spot, Ontario Place, and you know, the developers who at one point stood to profit from the Greenbelt, that kind of thing.
Only by $8.25 billion. That's all.
You know, small, trivial sums like that.
Small fry. We are actually going to return to the Super Bowl ad matchup later in the podcast because we have this thing on Tuesdays called Quote of Note. And Bonnie Crombie laid down the gauntlet against Doug Ford, and we're going to play that later, so stick around for that because it's worth waiting for. And with that, we are off to issue 2. Just when we thought Donald Trump had dropped the subject of tariffs for the duration of this election campaign, no, it's back with a vengeance. The president announced this week that he'd bring in tariffs on all non-U.S. steel and aluminum. And that comes as a shock to, in particular, 2 different Ontario cities where steel, JMM, is a major employer.
Yes, we are constitutionally required to mention Hamilton as often as possible in this podcast.
Correct.
So obviously, Hamilton makes a lot of steel, and there are a ton of jobs in Hamilton that are on the line if Canadian steel can't be exported to the U.S., or at least can't be exported without paying a large tariff. It's also a city where there are at least 2 ridings that I think you and I will both be watching closely on election night. In Hamilton East Stony Creek, Minister of Sport Neil Lumsden won under some, I would say, odd circumstances last time. That was a race where the former New Democrat, Paul Miller, was running as an independent, splitting the vote amongst the New Democrats, certainly. Lumsden ended up winning by 34%. So
he won with 34%.
Yes.
Not by 34%.
Yes, sorry.
He would love to have won by 34%.
Who wouldn't, right?
Yeah.
No. Yes, he won with 34% of the vote. And so we will see if this time, if there's a unified NDP vote, whether he will win again. He's the incumbent, or sorry, not the incumbent, the former incumbent.
Former sitting member.
Former sitting member.
This is one of my pet peeves, along with lieutenant instead of lieutenant, okay?
Yes.
Just so you know.
And, you know, if the Tories are as far ahead as some of the polls suggest they are, maybe Lumsden has nothing to worry about, but we will be watching nevertheless. Then there's also Hamilton Centre, where history of may repeat itself of a sort. You have the former sitting member, Sarah Jama, who is running again as an independent. She was removed from the NDP caucus over her remarks and statements about the war in Gaza. The NDP have their own candidate, local physician Robin Lennox. So we will see, it looks like, another split vote among the NDP in that riding. Hamilton Centre has almost always been represented by the NDP with a liberal Dom Agostino in the early part of the 21st century.
A long time ago.
Yeah, a long
time
ago.
It was Andrea Horvath's seat for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. So this will be one to watch. Normally, you would sort of assume it was an NDP lock, but obviously it's not going to be normal circumstances this time around. And who knows what the prospect of steel tariffs will do to the politics of Hamilton right now.
And not only Hamilton, there's another city, obviously, in Ontario where they make a lot of steel, and we should take a look at that one as well.
Yes, this is another seat worth watching. In Sault Ste. Marie, Algoma Steel is, I believe, the largest private sector employer in the region, supports a number of spin-off firms as well. Interesting firm. In the past couple of decades, they've been through a bankruptcy proceeding. There have been changes in ownership, that kind of thing. But politically, Sault Ste. Marie will be interesting to watch because Ross Romano, who was in cabinet, then was not in cabinet, he has opted not to run again. And so that's an open seat where, prior to Ross Romano, that was a seat held by the Liberals. I think the NDP really believe that they've got a strong chance to take it this time. Last time I checked the listing for Elections Ontario, we didn't have the official nominated candidates for the opposition parties, but the NDP definitely had one. The New Blue Party had one. But I believe I might be out of date on that one because I believe the parties have now said that they do all have full slates nominated.
Yeah, everybody's got, the three major parties have 124, all nominated, all spots nominated. Yeah, this is obviously a big deal. The auto sector has received billions of dollars in subsidies and investments to preserve EV jobs there. Steel companies have also seen some government funding as well to help preserve jobs there, right? That's fair to say.
And this goes back to long before we were talking about tariffs. The steel sector is a big emitter of greenhouse gases, and the federal and provincial governments have both provided hundreds of millions of dollars, very large sums to both Algoma Steel and in Hamilton, the Dofasco steel mill, ArcelorMittal. They are looking to electrify their steel mills. This is instead of using a bunch of coal to make steel, you use cleaner electricity. Ontario has a relatively clean electricity grid. So it's one way of removing pollution from the production of steel, but it's very expensive, and you got to make those costs back somehow. And again, if we're now talking about 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, there's going to be a lot of question marks about whether those investments were worth the money.
Exactly. So in other words, watch us on election night, because as we look at those ridings in particular, those two ridings in Hamilton and then the one in Sault Ste. Marie, we can really tell those are great focus groups to determine whether or not the Ford message about protecting us from tariffs will play in two places where that issue is huge. Yeah. Anyway, worth watching. Let's go on to issue 3. According to a new poll from Nanos, what issue is number 1, top of mind for Ontarians during this writ period? Is it tariffs? Is it Trump? Is it crime? No. The answer is healthcare. With a family doctor shortage and long wait times plaguing the system, the parties have made their pitches on how they're going to fix the many things that are wrong with our healthcare system. JMM, let's go through some of them now, shall we?
Right. So we've got, let's start with the Ontario Progressive Conservatives. They have pledged to spend $1.8 billion in order to create 305 healthcare teams, which help coordinate care in order to relieve some of the burden on family doctors who would be otherwise having to deal with this in their own private practices. There are currently 58 healthcare teams in the province, so this would amount to a very substantial expansion.
So there's 58 now. They want to get to 305. That's
a
long way to go.
The idea is to connect everybody with some form of primary care, even if it's not like an individual private practice family doctor. The healthcare teams would get people that kind of care.
On to the Liberals.
Right. So we've got the Liberals planning to spend more at $3 billion to recruit 3,100 family doctors by 2029. So that would be the end of their first mandate. They want to create 2 new medical schools and expand the capacity of current schools. Obviously, you don't just want to hire doctors and nurses. You want to create a bit more of a pipeline. We've talked about this a lot since COVID, frankly, and increasing the capacity to train new people is how you get the personnel side of healthcare a bit more on a solid footing.
Maybe getting recognizing the credentials of foreign-trained doctors as well, who could be a part of this solution in addition.
Yes, absolutely. The NDP are talking about $4 billion and 3,500 doctors by 2029. Again, the end of that first mandate. They would hire more doctors in Northern Ontario specifically. We've talked about this a lot, where like if you need any kind of specialized procedure or diagnostic in Northern Ontario, often your first healthcare step is get on a bus to Toronto or Ottawa, right? So more healthcare in Northern Ontario particularly, and just talking about international practitioners, they want to clear a path for the estimated 13,000 internationally trained doctors who live here to actually be able to work here.
And what about the Greens?
They have said they would hire thousands of doctors and nurse practitioners. We don't have a dollar figure for that. They have also advocated for a new hospital to be built in Huntsville and Bracebridge. We should mention that Parry Sound Muskoka is one of the ridings that the Greens are making a big push for in this election, as they did in the last one. They are hoping to elect Matt Richter there. So no surprise that they are talking about a big spend in Huntsville and Bracebridge. I guess we could also say that they are expected to announce their whole platform tomorrow, Wednesday of this week. So while we don't have a dollar figure with these promises, I expect that we will get a full costing in their platform later.
I'm trying to remember. Last election, didn't they come second in Parry Sound Muskoka?
Yes.
They were
Matt
quite
Richter has been
competitive.
there for a very long time. He's been a candidate there for many election cycles, and it was a very strong campaign. They put a lot of effort in, but it certainly doesn't hurt when you have Graydon Smith, the extremely popular mayor, running as the PC candidate there.
Nick Nanos, I've known Nick for a long time. He's a very fine pollster. His numbers are very good. And given how Trump and tariffs have dominated the news cycle over the past couple of weeks, you may think it's a bit surprising. It's entirely possible you could conclude it's surprising that healthcare comes in as the number one issue, until you remember, and we saw this not too long ago, right? Hundreds of people lining up in Walkerton, Ontario, because there was a new doc in town and they wanted to get rostered for that doctor's practice, and it was freezing, and yet people waited for hours because I think the doctor said, I'll take the first 400 or 500 of you. And I mean, the notion that people would be doing that in the 21st century in the province of Ontario, I think was a shock to a lot of people. But it does raise more questions about these promises. Right. And about how credible any of these promises are, given how difficult it has been to make progress on healthcare. I don't know. How does it look to you?
Well, I just to talk about Nick Nanos' numbers for a moment. I mean, in one sense, the idea that healthcare would be the most important issue in a provincial election is sort of like, it's a day that ends in Y, right? Like healthcare is the single biggest part of the provincial budget. Of course, it should be the most important issue that Ontario voters are thinking about right now. As for these specific promises, a lot of these billion-dollar promises, they are contingent on things like, increased federal health transfers that we have no clear way, no obvious way to predict which way things will go in Ottawa right now. That is very chaotic. I'll just put it that way. If we see a big change in federal politics, I don't think it's beyond the question to say that a federal conservative government might have more restraint with federal health transfers, for example. We might not be able to bank on some of the increases that people are hoping for. And then, the province is also, the Progressive Conservative Party is talking about spending tens of billions of dollars on things like infrastructure and spending to help protect people's jobs and livelihoods in the face of these tariff threats. So there is a fair question of, if that money can't be counted on from Ottawa and we've got all these other provincial priorities, where exactly are the billions of dollars in healthcare spending going to come from?
I do want to make a point about that, but I should also say, usually when elections in Ontario are about healthcare, it's very good news for Liberals and New Democrats and not good news for Conservatives. Conservatives love it when elections are about taxes and crime and that kind of thing. Yeah. But here's an election where the number one issue is healthcare, and the Liberals are 20 points back and the NDP are 25 points back of the Conservatives. So this is a paradox.
It's a weird election.
It is a weird election. No, it really is. Now, let me pick up on that issue about whether or not there will be bandwidth to help pay for additional healthcare expenditures if they're required. This is going to get a little in the weeds here.
It's where we live.
Our brand, yes, exactly. The debt to GDP ratio, which essentially measures how much debt we are carrying from all the money we have spent from Confederation until today, as a percentage of the overall economy, that number in the province of Ontario is a little north of 37% right now. That is a big number. The number for the federal government is 42%, even bigger. Why am I bringing this up? Because the reality is you can't borrow forever as much as you want. At some point, you've got to get a handle on things. And there are certainly concerns in many economic circles that if these debt to GDP numbers remain as high as they are, and if we end up having to spend tens of billions of dollars to protect people from whatever economic mayhem is going to come because of the tariffs, we are not going to have the fiscal capacity to do that. So that's why you want to try to keep your books in good shape so that when it is a rainy day, you got something in the kitty to spend. Right now, it's an open it's an open question as to how much we've got in the kitty that we can spend on this. Anyways, okay, we are going to move to our quote of note here because I guess we should say on Fridays we do our Your Column, My Column, where we talk about the stuff that we wrote for the website. But during the writ period, JMM and I are doing something a little different. We call it the quote of note because at least once a week in an election campaign, somebody will say something that will raise your eyebrows. So today's quote of note goes to Ontario Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, who was at a campaign event in Spadina, Fort York, talking about how pleased she was that her party had managed to raise enough money to run Super Bowl ads, and she posed this challenge to Doug Ford. Let's have a look.
So I was very proud that we were at the clout. We raised the money to run Super Bowl ads, and we're the only two parties that did. So let's say it's, the Ford against Crombie in this race, and I'm happy to challenge him anytime on his turf or on mine. And my turf's the gym, so if he wants to come at me, and we'll have a competition in the gym, and maybe we'll do push-ups. What do you think?
Now, there's a couple of things going on here, right?
Yes. I mean, Crombie is obviously having a little bit of fun. I am also reminded of Kathleen Wynne, whose last speech in the legislature in 2018, she went out of her way to say how important it is for politicians to look after their health and their physical fitness. And there's not like a ton of political overlap between Kathleen Wynne and Bonnie Crombie, despite them both being under the Liberal banner. But right here, we have that at least.
Well, here, okay, a couple of things on Crombie. Number one, this is a woman who turned 65 years old last week.
Yeah.
And she is making a point that this 65-year-old woman is in a lot better shape than the 60-year-old male Doug Ford.
Yes.
That's number one. Number two, you notice how she said, okay, it's me against him.
Yes.
Completely marginalizing the NDP.
Trying to box out the NDP, absolutely.
That is exactly what they always say you got to win the progressive primary first before you can take on the governing Tories. So this is certainly an attempt by Crombie to marginalize the NDP and say they're not part of the equation. It's just me against him. We'll see how much that works. Incidentally, how many push-ups can you do?
If we start talking about push-ups, then we're going to get into protein intake and creatine supplementation, and then the algorithm's going to put us in a totally different part of YouTube, and I just don't think anybody wants that.
We can't have that. We can't have that. So let's push on, shall we? If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always like to hear from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got this week?
So our email is from listener Hal Graham in Kingston, who writes, Stephen JMM, Doug Ford claims he will be best to protect Ontario against Trump. I haven't heard the other candidates challenge that notion directly. Is it true? How does Doug Ford's record back up this claim? Would he really be the best in standing up to Trump? How do Stiles, Crombie, and Schreiner compare in this category? What policies have been developed in each campaign on personal traits demonstrated that would stand the test against Trump? Thanks for helping us decide. Hal Graham in Kingston.
Hal, you will not be surprised to hear that all of the parties think that they will stand up to Donald Trump better than the other guys to protect Ontario jobs. Stiles, Crombie, Mike Schreiner of the Greens have all criticized Doug Ford over his ability to deal with Donald Trump, pointing out a couple of things. Number one, Trump and Ford are not going to be at any negotiating table looking across the table at each other anytime soon, if ever. Probably never. And the other thing is they would point to some bad business deals, bad in their view, that they believe the Premier has made during his 6.5 years in office. And let's go through a bit of a list here. You referenced Marit Stiles going to the Integrity Commissioner earlier in this term over the Terme Spa business on the waterfront. That investigation took place. Bonnie Crombie's candidate in Toronto St. Paul's, about whom, incidentally, I have a column up on the website if you want to look at that. Stephanie Smythe is her name. She had a news conference on the weekend saying that if the Liberals win, Bonnie Crombie will create a special investigator to look into all of the alleged malfeasance on the Greenbelt. Mike Schreiner, I think, of all the leaders, has been the most critical of the notion that Doug Ford is actually going to Washington, D.C. this week to have meetings, to try to get Donald Trump to drop the tariffs. It is unusual, I think it's fair to say, for a party leader to go to another country in the middle of a writ period. But of course, these are unusual times. What else you want to add to this for Hal's benefit?
Right. So we do have some proposals from various parties. The NDP have talked about giving short-term financial assistance to businesses affected by the tariffs. The Liberals have said that they would actually make loans available to private businesses at government rates. Obviously, the government of Ontario can borrow money at a lower rate than private businesses can. The Tories are talking about deferring $10 billion in business taxes over the course of 6 months, which is similar to measures that they did during COVID. Ford has said that the response to tariffs will have to be, a response on the scale of COVID. This is kind of what he means. And the Greens would create an investment tax credit to help unlock some spending for businesses. These are all strategies on how to deal with the threat of tariffs. You can certainly criticize the merits of one or the other. It's obviously difficult for, I don't think you are going to say which individual person would deal with Donald Trump the best. But, as Crombie has pointed out, there is really no chance that Ford is ever going to be sitting directly across the table from the president, right? That is a job for the prime minister, whoever that might be. We might have 3 of them this year. But the same is going to be true regardless of who the premier is after this election, right? The premier of Ontario can do a lot of things about policy within Ontario. It has, frankly, almost no leverage at the international level.
We've got one more as well this week. Here is one from a listener named Michelle Turcott, who's in Sturgeon Falls, which is about, I guess, halfway between Sudbury to the west, North Bay to the east, just north of Lake Nipissing, who writes, "Dear Steve and John Michael, I am hoping you can do a public service announcement regarding voting options. You can vote at your returning office until February 26th. There is also a service where staff from the returning office go to your house or your hospital bed and bring you your ballot. I am not sure why this is not more widely known, and I am hoping you will use your platform to spread the news. Love the show. Michelle Turcott, Sturgeon Falls, Ontario."
Well, Michelle, thank you very much for that. One other place that is important to mention here is the Elections Ontario website. They have just a wealth of information on their site, including, most important, a page about where you can find out which electoral district you are in and where you can vote within that district. From there, it is just a quick search to figure out who the candidates are in your riding. We will be putting a link to Elections Ontario in the comments. And just to add, one of the controversies about this election timing is that there are only going to be 3 days of early voting this time around. There were more in the previous election. But even without those days of dedicated early voting, as Michelle says, there are other options for people who are looking to vote but may not be able to make it on voting day per se.
Well, let me pick up on that because we have heard, yes, indeed. Michelle, thank you for this. I'm sure there are a lot of people who didn't know these were options to help make voting easier. We should also put on the record, I have heard considerable criticism from people during the course of this campaign who are eligible to vote in this election, but who may, for example, live outside the province or may even live outside the country. And because of perhaps substandard Canada Post service, or perhaps in the country in which they live, the postal service is substandard. And as a result, they will not get their ballot in a timely fashion, and they will not be able to get the ballot back to the authorities here in Canada in a timely fashion in order for their vote to be counted. And they point out, I guess we can have a big debate about the advisability of doing this, but I have heard the example given that there are elections for boards of directors. There are elections for condos. There are elections for party leaders where online voting takes place.
There are Ontario municipalities where you can vote online.
There you go.
Yeah.
And apparently that is not an option at all for this Ontario election. And some people obviously think if you live outside the country and you'd like to have your vote count, you would think there's a way to do this online so that you could exercise your franchise. Anyway, we put all that on the record as well.
We are already worried about what the turnout will be in this election, and I suspect this will not help. Again, if you would like to ask about the content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
Right on. And that is the OnPoli podcast for this Tuesday, February 11th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
And sitting right over there. Special thanks to our studio crew for making the video aspect of this podcast look so good. And we want to give a shout out to, Sheldon, can we get a shot? To the audience that has sat quietly without heckling and listened to the two of us yammer on for the past half an hour. How about a round of applause for all of you guys for sitting in here today? Thank you very much. Until Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.